Hello friends, happy Halloween. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Emily. Here on my channel, I make crystal videos, geology videos, small business videos, and more. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, be sure to subscribe because I put out new videos every single week. I also have a crystal shop, cosmicgeology.com. It will be linked down below. You can use code YouTube at checkout for a discount. Today I am dressed up as Oracle. She actually got so scared when she saw me in cat ears that she puffed up and her tail refused to depuff for like 5 minutes. So she has finally forgiven me now for wearing cat ears, but she's still not thrilled about it. So today's video is a little festive for Halloween. I wanted to talk about some spooky and potentially dangerous crystals and minerals. And while these minerals have potentially dangerous elements or properties, I don't want to promote any fear-mongering around crystals. This list is just for fun to share some interesting facts about these minerals, and if there's any safety precautions that need to be taken when handling them, I will discuss those. So it is a little bit clickbaity for me to say dangerous and scary crystals because many of these are harmless unless you're for some reason consuming them, ingesting them, breathing in their crystal dust, which is something you should never be doing whether the crystal is dangerous or not. But disclaimer aside, let's just get right into it and talk about some of these spooky and interesting crystals. So first up we have Vivianite, and Vivianite is not a dangerous crystal, it's actually really beautiful and I do have some in my shop. Vivianite is on the list of spooky crystals because it has been found on dead bodies. When Vivianite crystals are seen growing on dead bodies or bones, it can give information as to the conditions at the time of death. Phosphate in the bones reacts with iron and water to create Vivianite crystals. If Vivianite is present, we know it formed in a wet, iron-rich environment that was low in oxygen. These crystals form colorless but turn a dark blue color when they're exposed to oxygen. These crystals don't only form on bodies, but other organic materials such as shells and alongside fossils. And don't worry, the Vivianite crystals in my shop or on the market were not found on dead bodies. That's not the only place they can grow. In fact, the pictures that I've seen of Vivianite on bones does look quite different than the large, beautiful crystals we see on the market. I will insert a photo here of Vivianite growing on a bone. If you don't want to see a bone, close your eyes. Next up, we have asbestos. We talked a little bit about asbestos in my recent video all about serpentine because some varieties of serpentine actually are asbestos. Now, asbestos itself is not a mineral, but it describes a type of mineral that has a fibrous crystal structure. These minerals are used for their heat resistance and strength, but they can be extremely harmful if they are ingested or breathed in. Examples of asbestos minerals are chrysotile serpentine, crocodolite, and amphiboles. These fibrous minerals make the list of spooky and dangerous crystals because they are super harmful if ingested. Exposure to asbestos can damage the lungs and cause different types of cancers. Just touching a fibrous mineral or owning a polished crystal is completely safe, so don't be scared off of serpentine or other fibrous minerals just because of this. Handling raw asbestos may cause skin irritation, but the real harm comes from ingesting those little fibers. Handling polished crystals poses little to no risk. Definitely check out my video all about serpentine if you would like to learn more about what varieties of serpentine are asbestos and how to properly care for them if you're interested. Next up, we have a crystal called stibnite, which has a reputation for being extremely dangerous. Stibnite is an antimony sulfide mineral containing the element antimony, which causes similar effects in the body as arsenic if ingested. This is a mineral you definitely do not want to ingest in any way. But aside from washing your hands after touching this mineral and not consuming anything it has touched or been soaking in, it is perfectly safe to own. While it does contain these potentially super dangerous elements, elements on their own have different properties than they do when they are chemically bonded to each other within a mineral. Stibnite is nearly insoluble, which means the elements that are bonded together are not easily going to separate. Aside from this, you would need to ingest a significant amount of antimony to see these adverse effects, which just isn't going to happen from handling this mineral. Like I said, these elements, antimony and sulfur, are not just free floating around in the mineral and they could rub off on your hands. They are chemically bonded together, so they're not going to just rub off and poison you. You would have to actually consume the crystal dust. Next up, we have hutchinsonite, which is an arsenic sulfide mineral that contains thallium and lead. Those are all very dangerous elements on their own. While these are all very dangerous in their element form, again, they are much less harmful when they are bonded together within a mineral. As always, take proper precautions when handling minerals like this, such as not ingesting it or inhaling its dust, which hopefully is pretty easy to avoid those two things. Hutchinsonite is often found with orpiment, which is another arsenic sulfide mineral. We mentioned orpiment in my bumblebee jasper video, so while we're on the topic of arsenic and sulfur, let's add bumblebee jasper to this list. I made a whole video about bumblebee jasper and its composition, so I won't go too much into it now, but I do want to add it to this list of minerals to be cautious with because it does contain arsenic and sulfur. So use these precautions when handling bumblebee jasper as well. I do find bumblebee jasper to be a little bit on the more hazardous side, just because a lot of the pieces that I've seen of it are very crumbly and raw, and if you are just handling them, it can be easy to get these crystal particles on your hands, so definitely make sure you're washing your hands and, not eating the crystals, and you should be fine. Next up, we have cinnabar. Cinnabar is a mercury sulfide mineral deemed to be extremely dangerous due to its mercury content. However, like we talked about with the last two minerals, the elements within this mineral are bonded together, therefore they are less dangerous than they would be on their own as just pure elements. Of course, mercury is going to be extremely dangerous to humans when found on its own, but it's different when it's found within a mineral. But of course, wash your hands, don't ingest it, and another thing to be cautious of with this mercury mineral is don't heat it because this can create harmful fumes or particles that you do not want to be ingesting. As with all these other stones, avoid grinding it up or creating any sort of crystal dust that could possibly be inhaled. If you are just using these minerals for display on a shelf or in a display box and not really touching or handling them, they should really not be posing any risk to you. Keeping these kinds of minerals in a display case is a really good idea because some of them are sensitive to different types of light, humidity, and changes in temperature, which can cause them to be a little more unstable. Next up, we have amazonite, and this one may be a little bit surprising, but the common amazonite that we all know and love is on the list of spooky crystals. And why is that? Amazonite is actually technically radioactive. But what does radioactive really mean? Minerals that are radioactive are unstable. They contain elements that are constantly breaking down and emitting alpha, beta, or gamma rays, and creating decay products as they break down and change. Examples of radioactive elements include uranium, plutonium, thorium, and potassium. An important term for radioactive elements is the half-life, and the half-life is how long it takes for half of the atoms to decay. Eventually, all radioactive atoms decay, and then the element is stable and no longer radioactive and emitting these rays. Each radioactive element has a different half-life. The half-life of uranium is 4.5 billion years, whereas some elements have a half-life as short as just a few seconds. Now back to amazonite. Amazonite is a potassium feldspar mineral, and as I just mentioned, potassium is actually radioactive. Potassium is a fairly common element, and it is found in many different minerals or even foods we eat like bananas. We actually need to eat potassium even though, yes, it's technically radioactive. Not all potassium on Earth is radioactive, only a small percent is. And because the half-life of potassium is so large, it is 1.25 billion years, the amount of radiation it emits is very little and does not pose a serious risk. So keeping an amazonite crystal in your house is the same as eating bananas. It does not pose any significant risk to you. It's not going to cause you harm, even though it technically contains these radioactive elements. And of course, while the term radioactive sounds really scary, which makes it perfect for the spooky list, not all radioactive elements are equally as dangerous. It really depends on the half-life and the type of rays that these radioactive elements emit. Some of these dangerous particles can be stopped by something as simple as a piece of clothing or a piece of paper. So they're really not causing any harm to you just by a crystal sitting on your desk or your shelf. But again, you don't want to be ingesting it because it can cause damage if you ingest it. I think the moral of the story here is just don't be eating any crystals and you won't be having any problems. And remember that amazonite is a feldspar mineral, and feldspars are extremely common. They make up about 60% of the Earth's crust. You could probably walk outside right now and find a piece of feldspar out in nature. We are surrounded by feldspars. It is perfectly safe to bring a piece of amazonite into your house to enjoy it. It is not going to harm you. If amazonite was as dangerous and radioactive as other elements like uranium, it would not be so readily available on the crystal market. On this list, I mentioned some minerals that contain toxic elements within them, but pose little risk to own because these elements are insoluble and locked within the crystal structure. Even when exposed to water, it's difficult for these minerals to break down into elements that can cause you harm. However, this next crystal is a little bit different. Chalcanthite is a copper sulfate mineral that is extremely soluble, meaning it can break down and dissolve in water. When in water, chalcanthite releases copper, which can cause copper toxicity in large quantities. I would say this crystal is number one on the list for avoiding getting wet or ingesting in any way. Simply just touching or owning this stone isn't going to harm you. Just be sure to wash your hands afterwards. If you do own this stone, it's a good idea to keep it in a display case where it can't easily be disturbed. If you are looking to add chalcanthite to your collection, I would just be cautious because a lot of the pieces I saw out there on the market are lab grown. And I do assume that lab grown chalcanthite is just as dangerous when exposed to water and can pose the same risks. So regardless of which one you own, I would just be very careful with it. And last up on the list, we have a mineral called torbernite. Torbernite is another radioactive mineral, but this one is much more dangerous than amazonite because torbernite contains uranium. Torbernite is a copper phosphate mineral, and it's actually not very uncommon. It's sometimes found within granites. This crystal can release radon as it breaks down, so it's best to keep it in a well-ventilated area, away from places that you spend a lot of time, like in bed. It's also a good idea to keep this mineral in a glass case, or maybe just appreciate this crystal from afar and not add it to your collection. As with all the crystals, avoid ingesting it and take proper precautions if you are handling it. You won't drop dead if you own it or touch it, but it is good to be knowledgeable on how to properly care for and handle these potentially hazardous minerals. So that's all I have for you today on some spooky and dangerous crystals. While a lot of these minerals are very sensationalized online and people make it seem like you're just going to drop dead or be poisoned if you touch it or own it, most minerals are relatively safe to handle or be around, even when they contain elements that sound really scary like arsenic, sulfur, lead, mercury, antimony. Just know that when these elements are contained within a crystal, they are not as dangerous as they are on their own. So I hope I didn't spook you too much, especially with the amazonite. I don't want it to sound scary that it's radioactive. So I hope you enjoyed this video, maybe learned something new. Be sure to check out my crystal shop, cosmicgeology.com. It will be linked down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great Halloween.